Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Steve Zipperstein from UCLA. I want to welcome all of you to our very, very important webinar focusing on the impact of last week's United States presidential election on the Middle East, North Africa region. First, before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to express our sincere gratitude to our co-sponsors from UCLA, the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations, the Unison Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, and my home department, where I'm very, very honored to teach, the Luskin School of Public Affairs, Department of Public Policy. Before we begin, I just wanted to advise you of a few housekeeping items. First of all, while you can see us, we here on the panel cannot see or hear you. We are recording today's presentation. The video will be available on the UCLA Center for Middle East Development website, our YouTube and Facebook pages in the coming days. If you are joining us via Zoom, please note the following. Please note the chat window at the bottom of the screen where we will share announcements during the talk with you in that area, the chat box. However, you will not be able to use the chat box to add any of your own comments. Instead, if you have questions for our speakers, please type them in the Q&A window, which you can also find at the bottom of your screen. So please use Q&A at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you would like to ask our speakers. When you do so, when you use the Q&A and you type your question, please make sure to include your name, your country, and/or your affiliation, and we will announce your name, your country, and/or your affiliation when I read the questions to our panelists and to all of you. Only those of us on the CMED team will be able to see your questions. In some cases, we might answer questions in writing in that Q&A window for others to see. We do ask, however, given our time limitations, and we're going to go for about an hour and a half or so, in order to take as many of your questions as possible, please keep your questions concise, short, to the point. No speeches, no essays, please. We want to be able to get as many of them in as possible. For those of you joining us via our YouTube platform, please note you will not be able to ask a question because the comments section in our YouTube platform has been disabled. Well, we are very honored to be joined by three very, very distinguished speakers today. I've asked each of them to make opening remarks of around 10 minutes. I'll introduce them one at a time. Our first speaker, who will be joining us momentarily, is my dear friend, Mr. Zev First from New York City. Zev is a leading global political, business, and communication strategist who has advised political leaders, foreign principals, and corporate executives of Fortune 100 companies. He's the chairman and chief executive officer of First International Resources, an international corporate and political consulting firm he founded in 1992. Mr. First specializes in a whole range of activities. I'll just list a couple. He provides strategic counsel on highly sensitive political matters. He is a specialist in crisis management. He brings a unique perspective of someone who has worked at the intersection of business and politics for more than 30 years. Zev, welcome. Please unmute, and I will turn the floor over to you. Go ahead.
Steve, thank you very much. Very gracious, and I enjoy hearing about myself, so thank you. I would like to begin with a very quick and broad, not necessarily analysis, but the results of the election that took place exactly 1 week ago here in the United States. And I would like to begin with everyone keeping in mind throughout this session that the president-elect, Donald Trump, is not running again. And therefore, having my next election in the back of my head all the time is not going to be a factor in the formulation and conduct of American foreign policy, whether it affects the Middle East, North Africa, or anywhere else in the world, or for that matter, all of his internal political moves here in the United States. That being said, I would think that it would be important to keep in mind that the biggest swings to Trump in last week's election were swings from the blue states, from states that generally vote Democrat. And voters in these traditional Democrat states, strongholds, counties, whatever, had a lower vote turnout this year than they had in 2020. And at the same time, the counties with the biggest Republican voters delivered more than 1 million, actually 1.2 million more votes for Trump than they did in 20. And counties with the biggest Democratic victories in 2020, those for Biden, delivered almost 2 million votes less for Vice President Harris. The Democrats basically failed to focus early enough on inflation as a key economic problem for President Biden and for this administration, notwithstanding that the United States, in dealing with post-COVID inflation today, is in a far better position than just about every European country. The fact of the matter is that they did not use and perform and respond to the entire issue of inflation as it affected the average voter here in the United States throughout the campaign. Post-COVID inflation has taken down many, if not all, incumbent governments that had elections. And I refer specifically to Britain last year or 2 years ago, Japan, South Africa, South Korea. In France, President Macron lost his parliament. And so while clearly everyone is now focused on what happened here in the United States, incumbents over the last year or two, or even three, have not fared very well when they went to a general vote. Moving away from what happened in the United States and how this can or cannot or will not affect Middle East, North Africa region, I am frankly pleasantly surprised, or surprised may be the wrong word, but I'm certainly not negative, to see that the names of the beginning of Trump's national security team, and I refer specifically to the Secretary of State, while not official yet, Rubio, and Mike Waltz, who is rumored or has been said to lead the National Security Council as the president's national advisor. They are hawks on the subject of Iran and certainly on China. And there is some pushback by having those names put into the public discourse that demonstrates, at least for me, that we're dealing with, and we will be dealing with, not an isolationist foreign policy, but a muscular foreign policy. And I think we should keep that in mind as we move forward over the next several weeks and months, if not years. I think that Trump, the president-elect, will press the Saudis to normalize ties with Israel, and clearly the kingdom is going to need something from Israel, raid the Palestinians. And I believe that this actually could lead to friction between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President-elect Trump. Let's remember that 4 years ago, when Prime Minister of Israel called Biden to congratulate him on winning the presidency in January 21. First of all, it took the Prime Minister 2 weeks to call Biden, but nevertheless, when he did, Trump publicly excoriated him, and their relationship for a good 2.5 years after that was, to be kind, complicated, if not non-existent. Nevertheless, since the election last week, we have been witness to, and we have heard from the Prime Minister of Israel that he has spoken to Trump 3 times. And I believe that the question mark that we all have, insofar as it affects the MENA region, is how will the bilateral U.S.-Israeli relationship affect the United States as well as Israel in the Middle East and North Africa. Let me stop there because we could get into Q&As and we can expand on that, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you also, by the way, for giving us your analysis regarding the impact of post-COVID inflation here and elsewhere around the world. Very, very interesting. And also for your initial reaction to at least some of the names that we're hearing in the media. Mike Waltz for National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, nothing official yet, but those are apparently the picks for those positions. And I'll have more questions, I'm sure the audience will as well, about some of the other very, very key roles a little bit further down, as well as at the Secretary of Defense level, which we have not yet, at least as of right now, heard about. Our next speaker, another very, very close friend of CMED and me personally, I'm very, very grateful to say, is Jay Footlick. You see him there on the screen. Jay served as Special Assistant to President Bill Clinton in the White House, where Jay worked on a range of domestic and foreign policy issues, including extensive work in the Middle East and North Africa region. Jay also served as the President Clinton's liaison to the American Jewish community. You see, he's quite young. He must have been a teenager at the time. And I could go on and on and on about Jay, who, I will only say this, in the last several months, Jay has done heroic work, trying to assist with bringing home the hostages from Gaza. And someday maybe the full story will be known about what Jay has done. Jay, welcome to our webinar. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for your very warm introduction. Great to be up here as well with Zev and Mara. I'll touch for just a moment on some of the things that Zev mentioned regarding the election last week, and then move to 3 short points about what we perhaps can expect from a second Trump administration vis-a-vis the MENA region. I think, first of all, Mr. Trump may not have an election or re-elect behind him, but there will be midterm elections, and those creep up rather quickly, as everybody on this call, I think, understands, especially here in Washington, where the entire U.S. House will be up and a third of the U.S. Senate. So he does have to, in a sense, be aware of that time reference and that time frame as well. And in the past, when the president has had both the House and the Senate within the same party control, it hasn't always led to a smooth and easy pathway to enacting legislation and into pushing the president's priorities. So we'll have to see, and I think there will be many months and perhaps years where we go back and analyze the results of this past election. We have to also, I think, remember that the vice president had a very, very short period of time to sort of jump in. And there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking, a lot of should have, would have, what we could have done if we had had a different situation and more perhaps lead time. Again, we'll leave that to the pundits to talk about in the future. I'll try and hit on three points as it relates to what we may be able to expect or look into the crystal ball and see moving forward from a second Trump term. One, for anyone who says they can look into this crystal ball and see something with any definitive nature, don't buy a piece of real estate from them. If there's one hallmark of this of Trump looking back to the first term, it's that lack of certainty, lack of predictability. There were certain tactics, certain notes that were sounded, but overarching strategy was not their strong point. And so I think trying to sit here now and craft and predict what the priorities will be, I think is a little bit murky and a little bit difficult. I think it's also important to remember that foreign policy generally was not a driving force from what we're seeing in exit polling and so forth. There were a lot of other issues. Ev referenced the economy and so forth. And just generally speaking, Americans, with few exceptions, don't really pay that much attention to foreign policy now. It's a unique time, for sure, with a war in Europe and a war in the Middle East region, and that does occupy a lot of time and space. But for the average American voter, those are not things that typically drive participation. Again, exceptions can be made for the American Jewish community, American Arabs, and Muslims, perhaps in Michigan, and a few pockets here and there. But mostly, I think it's domestic issues, and so I think it's hard to predict. And I think our allies and adversaries around the globe are sort of finding it difficult to read the tea leaves as well, and to understand where a second Trump term may go. The second thing I'd say is, what do we know about how the president conducts policy? Well, it tends to be very transactional, right? So, if there's one thing we hear from travel to Israel and Gulf states in particular, there's a particular preference I think for this nature of policymaking. Tell us what you expect of us. Tell us what you want. Don't lecture to us about this, that, and the other vis-a-vis human rights and so forth. Lay out clearly what we can do for you and what you can do for us. Shake on it, build some hotels, and move on. And so whether it's expanding the Abraham Accords, which I assume will be on the agenda, it's a foreign policy achievement under the Trump administration. Again, we all know that there were elements throughout the region having these conversations going back a decade or two, but we'll give credit to the former president and his team for clinching the deal they clinched. Whether or not they're going to be able to expand with Saudi or Qatar or perhaps some Asian countries, I think remains to be seen. And my guess is that they will invest a fair amount of time doing so. But they will have to balance it with isolationist voices, not only within their own party and on Capitol Hill, but the vice president-elect has also voiced isolationist views. He's talked about the desire to, for example, wrap up what's happening in the region, and the lack of desire to go to war with Iran, for example. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just gives us an idea of where the vice president is. I think, again, from past experience, we understand that in a second Trump administration, the most important voice will be one and only one. But there will be others around the table that will try and exert some political pressure and try and influence where the president goes on policy. I'll go to the third point, which is I agree with Zev that the choices so far, I describe them as somewhat conventional in terms of what we are hearing on the foreign policy front, from a sitting congressman to a sitting U.S. senator. These are not folks that have been brought in from the outside that typically would have trouble getting confirmation. Again, if they obviously control the Senate, confirmation will be less of an issue. But still, these are colleagues, and there usually is some kind of professional courtesy that is extended.
So while we're waiting for Jay to rejoin us, Mara, if you could get ready, I'm going to introduce you, and we'll come back to Jay when he's able to reestablish his connection. We're very thrilled to have a very, very distinguished academic, Professor Mara Rudman, who is the James Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she directs the Ripples of Hope project aimed at identifying practical approaches to help democratic leaders resolve key challenges. She also served in various positions in the United States government, including as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, Deputy Envoy for the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace at the State Department, Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and as Chief Counsel to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Jay, we'll come back to you after we hear from Professor Mara Rudnick. The floor is yours for 10 minutes, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with all of you and to have this important conversation. I appreciate it. I should say I'm very definitely a professor from practice, so I should not be confused with anyone from academia. That's not been where my career has been. It's been much more in the intersection, I would say, of politics, policy, and process with a national security lens, and that's very much how I come to this conversation. I think there are 5 key things I want to stress, and hopefully I can do it in less than 10 minutes. The first is that I think the way that I and many of my colleagues who were certainly very disappointed, just to be honest, about the results of this election, but how we are looking at things going forward is dividing into defense and offense. And I think it's not just those in the opposition in the United States who are looking at things that way. In other words, I think they're framing, when I say defense, it's what things would this potential Trump administration break irreparably. And in those areas, those in opposition need to have a strategy going forward that can ideally keep things from being broken that cannot be fixed going forward. And then the being on offense is looking both at making sure that as a voice in opposition, there's a vision going forward for the country, and I would argue for the world, the United States' role in the world, that's an affirmative vision, and that folks can pivot to as they're articulating what they disagree with about what is likely to be the President Trump's vision for the world as executed through particular policy actions. And I don't think this breaks up on party lines necessarily at all. I think the question of isolationists versus internationalists is a challenge that within the United States we have in both of our main political parties. And we have the tensions between them. And as Jay pointed out so well, the vice president is a great example. The vice president designate, J.D. Vance, is a great example of the isolationist strain within his party. I think that for Mr. Trump, it can go back and forth a little bit, less consistent. And I agree that we see in the 2 appointments that have been floated as seemingly the way the administration will go in terms of the Secretary of State designate in Marco Rubio and the potential that Mike Waltz is the national security advisor. I agree with Jay's characterization. Those are more conventional choices. As I believe has been pointed out, who gets named as the Secretary of Defense will be hugely consequential, not only because every person that served as Secretary of Defense under President Trump in his first administration came out against him and warned of his dangers. And some of the names have been floated there would be a significant concern for the country and for the world, and frankly, for the United States military as well. And that is why my second point is that there's a key race that I don't believe my colleagues have mentioned that's going to tell us a lot about what happens, and that is in the Senate leadership race. The competition for majority leader in the Senate, since Mitch McConnell announced some time ago that he would not be standing as majority leader as the Republican leader in this upcoming session of Congress. And so there's a race, and there are 3 candidates. 2 of those 3 candidates, I would say, are very much both from the internationalist grouping within the Republican Party, and they're also institutionalists. And the third is much less so on both counts, and that would be Rick Scott from Florida. He also has to date had much less support within the Republican caucus in the Senate. We will see. One of the things I do note about the 2 individuals who have been floated to be named for Secretary of State and for National Security Advisors, they're both from Florida. And Mr. Trump's chief of staff designate for the White House, Susie Wiles, is also a Floridian, and Rick Scott is from Florida. And so we'll see what dynamics play out. But I would just urge people to watch closely on what happens in the Senate leadership race and the timing of it. Mitch McConnell has been criticized by folks in the Trump camp for putting those elections very soon, I believe next week, very early. And two of those three candidates have been under a fair amount of criticism from the Tucker Carlsons and others of the right-wing camp. So we'll see some key directionals coming out of that, of who emerges, who is elected by their colleagues in the Republican caucus on a ballot that is a ballot where people don't have to. No one knows how any individual has voted. It's a blind ballot for the Senate leadership. My third point is, I think I would urge folks not to look at things as international, as foreign policy and domestic policy, but more look at national security and economic security for the United States, because those issues increasingly emerging. And again, this is regardless of party. And so while I may disagree strongly with many of the points that Donald Trump ran on in this campaign, what I would say, I think he comes at it in a different way, but I think where there's a similarity between the Biden administration and what would be the incoming Trump administration is seeing that the United States and its role in the world and the role of the president in safeguarding and safety and security of the American people is the roles of looking at what the United States needs to do economically and how we interact with other countries on that score, and what we do in terms of national security are very much interrelated. And so that brings me to my fourth point, which is that when we try to divine or watch what the Trump administration may be doing or planning or executing with respect to the Middle East region, I would first take it up a level. In other words, looking at the global landscape and how the Middle East region fits into that global landscape. And what do I mean by that? The United States and others as well, Europeans, pretty much many others throughout the world, have been subject to, had to anticipate the partnerships, however informal, that are increasingly occurring between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And so when we look at the Middle East region, for example, looking at the dynamics with Iran, knowing that President Trump has very close relationships with Putin, and that may play out in a number of ways that a number of folks, including me, are quite concerned about with respect to Ukraine. It may also play out in ways that people don't anticipate with respect to Iran. President Trump has reportedly made some strong statements to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I believe said some things publicly about what Israel should do vis-a-vis Iran. At the same time, he's clearly working very closely. However, informally, he's had several conversations already as president designate with Vladimir Putin. So just in the last week or two, and Russia and Iran are clearly, for the most part, working very closely together on a number of fronts. How do the Saudis, who also have strong relationships with President Trump and with others in his family, and the Crown Prince in particular that way, how will they juxtapose their relationships in this context? They are set to be a major point of leverage. They've also been balancing their interests vis-a-vis China and the United States. That's not likely to disappear entirely. Recall that it was China who brought the Iranians and the Saudis together for an initial agreement a couple of years ago. And so watching where and how all of those actors interact and how it may play into what the Trump administration says they're going to do, would like to do, starts pivoting on, will be important to look at. And also bring it back to looking at what bilateral relationships are like with each country in the region and how that squares, as well as looking at where the different regional relationships may shift. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of economic national security intersections when we analyze through that frame as well, that will probably have implications for how this incoming administration approaches the region and issues within it. And finally, what does this mean and I don't mean that as finally, but I think it's an important question to ask, what does this mean, obviously, for Palestinians, for the Lebanese, for those, the many innocents on the ground who have been so dramatically affected by the actions that Hamas and Hezbollah took against Israel and how Israel has responded to them. What will it take for Israel to recognize that its own interests can only be served by figuring out some pathway forward for Palestinians, for the many, many Palestinians and Lebanese who are not affiliated with Hezbollah or Hamas, and that being able to defeat Hamas ultimately requires having some plan, some vision going forward for Palestinians that is viable, and whether a country like the Saudis, whether the Crown Prince will recognize that he potentially has tremendous leverage to push for that kind of approach. Those are all open questions, but important to analyze each of these actors and what their interests are and how you might navigate to that. As I said, coming back to where I started, at the same time ensuring that those who are very concerned about irreparable damage in the United States or in the world have plans to be able to counter or stop things that might be actions that might be going in that direction. So with that, I'll close off.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you so much for that terrific analysis. Let me go back to Jay. He was on his third point when he had a little internet glitch. Jay, why don't you wrap up here, and then we've got some questions. Go ahead.
I actually think between Zev and Mara, we covered it. My last point was just that they were fairly conventional picks, and I think Mara brings up a very important point, which is the Senate leadership race and the interplay with Congress. There are isolationist voices, as Mara said, in both parties, and there will have to be some kind of equilibrium, some kind of balance achieved there.
Okay. So let me thank all of our panelists, and let me invite Zev and Mara to turn their cameras back on. I'm going to get to our first round of questions from the audience. We have some terrific questions. I would invite all of you, please be thinking about your questions. Usually what happens is that we kind of get to the last 10 minutes and all of a sudden we get a lot of questions and we don't have time to deal with all of them. So please type your questions in the Q&A box. I will kind of use my power of the pulpit here to ask the first question of all of you, and then I'll read three more questions, much better than mine from our audience, by the way. My question is really just about kind of what's the backroom parlor talk in Washington, in the New York-Washington corridor, about who might be filling some of the subsidiary roles when it comes to the Middle East, North Africa region. For example, any chatter about who might become Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, any chatter about Deputy Secretary of State, any chatter about who might become the Middle East coordinator at the National Security Council, taking over for Brett McGurk, will there be a role for some of the people that dealt with the region in the first Trump administration, such as Brian Hook, who had the Iran file, Jason Greenblatt, who had the Israel-Palestine file. What are you hearing about some of the other roles that are key to the region? That's my question. Now let me get to some audience questions for you, and then I'll come to each of you in the order in which you spoke. First Zev, then Jay, then Mara, and you can answer all or any of the questions, and I'll give you each about 5-10 minutes to do so. First question is from Marina Ingman of the United States, and Marina asks about not so much the MENA region per se, but a question that is now quite relevant in Ukraine and may reverberate in the Middle East region. Question: President Trump established a friendly relationship with Kim Jong-un of North Korea during his first term. Are there any projected changes in American policy vis-a-vis North Korea? Very good question. Thank you, Marina. Our dear friend, longtime dear friend of CMED, Antonia Dimou from Greece, asks the following question: what are the prospects of a second Trump administration reinvigorating the Trump peace plan of early 2020, originally titled, quote, Peace to Prosperity, a vision to improve the lives of the Palestinian people, the so-called deal of the century? What are the chances of Trump in round two reinvigorating that plan to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as part and parcel, Antonia asks, of a potentially broader peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then our final question for the first round comes from our friend Anne Saror from Canada, who asks, does the election of President Trump, or re-election of now President-elect Trump, increase the probability that Bibi Netanyahu will remain in power indefinitely? Great questions. Let's get some more from the audience while I give our panel a chance to answer. Zev, over to you first for 5 to 10 minutes, whatever you need.
I would like to actually focus on the last question first, because I think that the possibility or probability of another deal of the century is not going to happen right away, primarily because Bibi Netanyahu is focused not only on the bilateral Israeli-US relationship, but more important for him, his domestic political relationships. And he in no way wants his government to fall, which means that several of the coalition partners, primarily the Minister of Treasury, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, have an outsized say and influence and political power with Bibi Netanyahu, with the prime minister. And therefore, whatever we may think will happen in the bilateral US-Israeli relationship, or the relationship or the pressure that the United States can bring on either Hezbollah, less so Hamas, needs to be put in the context primarily of Israeli domestic politics, very clearly. And I think we need to constantly focus on that. Secondly, I have not heard, and therefore I cannot answer your first question with regard to who are some of the other names, some of the other people that may be brought into the administration on the level of whether it's Assistant Secretary for Middle East Affairs or whatever. So I am staying away from that. I do think that the bilateral US-Saudi relationship will play an outsized role in this, and therefore will affect the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, because I think Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, is not going to enter into an agreement in which Israel at least has to say something about the future relationship with the Palestinians, whether it's a two-state solution or whatever, without some sort of indication from Israel of, not necessarily right now, but without an indication from Israel, Saudi Arabia is going to have I find going to be very difficult into entering into or normalizing a relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the kingdom. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Zev. Jay, over to you.
Thank you. So regarding Antonia's question, the landscape has changed dramatically since that document was unveiled. As I recall, at the time, it was pretty roundly rejected by the Palestinians. I can't imagine that they would find this any more appealing today, given the situation on the ground. And which Palestinians are we talking about? Are we talking about a reinvigorated Palestinian Authority? Are we talking about the current leadership in Ramallah? I think there's just so many unanswerables right now. With that said, I'm sure the architects of that plan will engage in another effort to try and sell this regionally. I agree with Zev. Whatever the Saudis were willing to accept then, they are not likely willing to accept today without substantial, maybe not substantial, but without something meaningful, a gesture toward the Palestinians. Again, given the deal-making nature of the president-elect, he may wish to make another go at it. Sort of related to the first question in answering this, Jared Kushner, who was such a visible part of the first administration has been, I think so far much quieter. I don't want to say fully absent because he's a family member, and resides in Florida. And my expectation is when there is an interest or a desire to engage on an issue of importance to him, that he will do so. But thus far, we don't see any signals that he's going to play a major role. And I think he and David Friedman and others were such an integral part of creating the plan and then pushing it and chasing, Greenblatt as well. So I think they may want to use parts of it and dust it off and reconfigure it, but I think it's a harder sell this time around, and there will be other considerations to take into account. Very briefly on, I agree with what Zev said. I think for Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's largely domestic. I think he'll do all he can, as we're seeing his legal case is quickly approaching. I think December 2nd or 3rd, he is supposed to be back in court. He is now backtracking on a pledge not to use the war as an excuse to delay this, and is now saying, I'm a wartime prime minister. I can't possibly prepare and be expected to put on a proper defense. So we'll wait to see. My expectation is that he will do all he can to expand, perhaps call for elections, and expand his base so that he is really not held hostage by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others. That doesn't mean I think he'll be any less extreme necessarily, but I don't think he even feels comfortable. So I think it's much more about what happens domestically, much less about the relationship between he and Trump, which we understand is not all that terrific to begin with. So again, I also am not hearing, watch who's making the pilgrimage down to Mar-a-Lago, and perhaps some of those will be announced, but I'm not hearing specific names of folks. I think it's a very good question, but I think we'll have to wait a few weeks to see who's named.
Okay, thank you so much. Amara, over to you. And by the way, audience, thank you. I have 4 fabulous questions waiting for the next round. Keep them coming. Mara, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. I'll start where Jay left off. I concur with both Jay and Zev on any names you hear right now. I wouldn't believe them, because folks who are using the public stage to try to spin themselves, it didn't work on National Security Advisor. It didn't work on Secretary of State. I think it shows, and I think it'll be interesting to watch Susie Wiles as Chief of Staff in the White House, because she's a quiet behind-the-scenes operator. From what I've heard and seen during the campaign, she also played this role of folks who are out there publicly trumpeting themselves are not the ones who ultimately get what they want by doing so. So we'll see how long it lasts. But to me, the biggest sign of who's been announced so far goes to her power and the way that she operates. And so that's what I'd look at in the other roles. The one other small point is for the National Security Council staff positions, don't hold that to like Brett McGurk had the role of Middle East coordinator. Each administration coming in, each president has tremendous flexibility in how they structure their NSC staff, how they structure their White House staff at large. So there may be people, Jason Greenblatt did not have the same title that Brett McGurk had, that others, so within the White House, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility on roles and titles. And the only titles that are set are those that have to go for confirmation at state, at defense, at other agencies. So the one thing I think I would expect is that there would be many more political appointees for things like the assistant secretaryships, whereas under the Biden administration, they tried to, and you can, whether it worked or not, it was part of their goal to have career folks, career Foreign Service officers, career civil servants in much more senior roles that required confirmation. I don't think we'll see that with President Trump. My one caveat on that is actually I was fascinated to see somebody I work with at the University of Virginia, Steve Mull, the vice provost for global affairs there, has taken leave to run the Trump State Department transition. He is a career Foreign Service officer. I still could not tell you what his political, who he might have voted for or not. And so I thought it was fascinating that he was asked to come in to lead the transition team for the State Department, which goes to, we won't know until we know, but prejudging some of the stuff is probably a mistake. I just think that I agree that the Netanyahu's relationship with Trump is not what will be determinative of Netanyahu's continued tenure. It's domestic politics, largely along the lines of what's been outlined. What I do think is interesting is the parallels between Trump and Netanyahu and how they navigate in what their interests are. Listen, they both were very interested in staying out of jail and in using the office of the prime ministership or the presidency to keep them out of jail. In the case of the United States, the Supreme Court obliged by its sweeping decision on presidential immunity going into this election. But putting it kindly, the way that both look at economic security and national security is interlinked is one area. The ways that they deal with the criminal charges against them. And what I've seen in terms of Netanyahu, whether he only said it publicly now or not, it was clear to me from October 7th on that his major goal was looking at this as maximizing his personal survival, which meant, being fully in bed with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And Jade would know this much better than I, but I would just say from what I was seeing from the outside, very much at the expense of hostages and hostages' lives. So I think there couldn't be a clearer example. In terms of the future with North Korea and the relationship, listen, I think that in terms of what President Trump has already shown in how he operates is that personal flattery is an advantage. And I think most international leaders have already recognized that. I think the North Korean leader played it to a fare thee well. And so I think that will be a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge for those who are appointed to these senior national security positions in the United States, whether it's Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz or whoever becomes Secretary of Defense. Because in the two names thus far, those folks are savvy enough international actors in Waltz and Rubio that they know how others are playing the game. And frankly, they also see intelligence briefs, which tell you how to interact, what's going to be most effective in interacting with other international leaders. They know everyone through the world is getting those right now on how to best play President Trump. So I put the North Korea relationship in that category, but it's also why I said looking at and analyzing China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and their interactions, and what that may mean in terms of what Trump's relationship has been with each of them, and how it may differ in terms of the leaders in each of those areas, will be important to watch as we try to figure out what impact in regions that we care about as well. I would also just echo, though, I think that the Saudis are in a tremendously powerful position. I hope that the Crown Prince at MBS holds out, sees the importance of a pathway to a Palestinian state, of a meaningful progress on that. I don't think it's about negotiations starting tomorrow. So I think Zev and I may be saying the same thing, but in very different ways, because I think people hear pathway to the Palestinian state think that means, you're calling out the negotiating team tomorrow. I don't think that, first of all, I don't think that's what the Biden administration meant. I don't think that's what's going to be most effective. I think there's a lot of parallel paths that need to be pursued, but it's kind of what outcomes you're getting towards. I think the Saudis are in a great position to be able to leverage that. I'm a little less convinced that that's what they'll consider a priority at the end of the day. But I do think that over time, the reality of the fact that you're not going to be, if you're Israel, if you're the rest of the region, you're not going to be able to shut down Hamas without having viable alternatives. I think that reality will prevail. I just don't know over what period of time. So I think I covered all the main questions.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel. I'm now going to plow through about 6 or 7 questions from the audience. They're all terrific questions. Again, I'll go back to the panel. You don't have to answer every single one, but I want all of the members of the audience to hear what their colleagues are asking because these questions are just terrific. The first is from our friend Mohammed Shmaisani from Jordan. And I'll summarize his question. It's a bit lengthy. Basically, he is asking the panel, and Maura, you just talked about this a bit. To what extent do the panelists believe the Trump administration, incoming Trump administration, will exercise leverage over Israel to end the war in Gaza, end the war in Lebanon, and I'll add to the question to take tangible steps toward Palestinian statehood in exchange for MBS agreeing to normalize relations with Israel, possibly join the Abraham Accords. To what extent would the Trump administration be willing to exert leverage on Israel to achieve that? Second is from our friend Nimrod Novik from Israel. He's asking, from the macro to the micro perspective, what's the likely response of the Trump administration to Israeli annexationists making good on their agenda in the West Bank and Gaza? There was some news this morning about possibly Smotrich pushing for annexation of settlements. So very live issue right now. The next question is from Elmadi Habib Allah from the United Arab Emirates, who asks, what are the prospective policies regarding Red Sea security, Horn of Africa of the incoming Trump administration? And do we know whether the incoming administration has any clear plan to stop the ongoing, terribly destructive conflict in the Sudan? Next question from Mate Sazali from the Netherlands. How does the panel see the chances of a nuclear deal with Iran during a second Trump presidency? And now let me move, well, I do have a couple of more. We've got about 40 minutes, so I think I'll hold these remaining questions for a final round. I'll give each of you, again, figure 5 to 7 minutes to leave time for a final round of questions. And this time, I'll go back and begin again with our friend Zev.
With regard to the question of Trump exerting leverage on Israel, it all depends on whether he has something with Saudi Arabia. And I do believe that they are focused, well, at least his people are focused on the possibility of an agreement with Saudi Arabia. And therefore, Saudi Arabia has, and I agree with Mara, Saudi Arabia has a tremendous amount of leverage with the United States on what they would need in order to enter into some sort of agreement with Israel, whether it's normalization or somewhat less than normalization. So I do believe that there's more leverage that Saudi Arabia has over the United States on this issue than the United States has over Israel. At the end of the day, though, Netanyahu, as we all have said, is very much focused on his own personal issues with the criminal issues that he's facing, and as Jay indicated, technically is supposed to respond to by December 2nd or 3rd, although he's trying to push that off because of the war now. But I think that is, at the end of the day, for any leader to face any indictment causes a big problem, because the last thing any of us are going to think about if we have an indictment hanging over our head at the end of when we get into bed at night is going to be, how do I deal with that? What can I do tomorrow that will lessen the possibility of everything turning negative to me? And therefore, I think many, many of the decisions that Prime Minister Netanyahu is making is for his own political survival and his own political interest. I would be surprised also if the United States or the Trump administration, and I do not have any knowledge of what they are discussing, but I would be surprised if they would agree to, or frankly allow, Israel to annex the settlements on the West Bank. And I do not think that Rubio, potential Secretary of State designate, is like former Secretary of State Pompeo in basically going along with almost everything that Israel wanted. So I think that there will be pushback from the United States if the annexation issue really becomes serious. I know that Smotrich said what he said yesterday, but I don't see that happening, certainly not in the near future. I don't have anything to with regard to the nuclear deal on Iran with Iran. Look, it was Trump who pulled out of the JCPOA, and look where Iran is today, vis-a-vis where they were 3 years ago. No, actually 7 years ago now. Whether or not there are any lessons to be learned from what happened as a result of the U.S. pulling out of the JCPOA, I don't know whether the new Secretary of State is focusing on that right now. But I don't see any possibility of the United States or the Trump administration pushing to reset the nuclear deal with Iran. Now, the weakness of Iran, because of what's happening in Lebanon now, and what happened in and with Hamas, if they are indeed feeling weak, then they may come up with something. But I don't see that happening. So I think the nuclear deal with Iran is off the table for the foreseeable, certainly for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you, Zev. Jay, over to you.
I'll try and make this quick because I agree largely with what Zev has said. I think there's already been some chatter here in Washington, D.C. about the desire of some in Bibi's administration to move quickly on the issue of West Bank annexation. And quietly, there have been folks suggesting that not so fast, especially if this could potentially interfere with some of the other priority agenda items of the administration. That's a misread on the part of the right wing in Israel to think that they now have carte blanche to do what they want within this administration. And again, everything, as we've seen before, tends to be, or many things tend to be very personal when it comes to this particular president or president-elect now. And a lot of it may depend on the nature of the discourse between him and the prime minister. Another factor, I think, in that is he campaigned largely on the issue of no wars, right? There were no wars during my first term. The Democrats get in and now, the world's on fire and we're going to go back to no wars. Well, that can mean, many things, but I think there certainly is some expectation that he will try and rein in Zelensky or tell him that the clock is ticking. And I think a similar message will be delivered to the Prime Minister of Israel. This cannot be endless. This needs to stop. There are also differing voices potentially that he may feel beholden to, Arab American and Muslim voices, certainly some within his own family now. And I don't think we should discount the potential impact. I'm not saying they're going to be responsible for crafting policy, but again, from past experience, we do know that they do have the ability to have impact. And these are largely unpopular wars, focusing back on what he wants to focus on here at home, which is the economy. We know that it's far cheaper to provide foreign aid and to provide assistance to Ukraine than engaging in a war ourselves, and certainly avoiding, potentially a wider conflagration on the European continent or in the Middle East. But for the average American recovering from hurricanes in North Carolina and Florida and elsewhere, that calculation may not be as understandable or as apparent. So I think there will be an effort to try and shut down the conflicts as they are right now. Mara said something many things interesting, but one thing that she said that caught my ear was the relationship between the president-elect and Putin. And maybe therein lies the key to some kind of progress vis-a-vis Iran. As Zev said, Iran is weakened. The crown jewel, Hezbollah, has been decimated. A lot of the other proxies have also been degraded. And they may be looking for some kind of opportunity to sort of come in from the cold to a degree. Again, I think it was in many respects a mistake to pull out of an agreement without having something to replace it, right? And we see what the Iranians have done over during this intervening time. Hopefully, Zev mentioned learning from past mistakes. Hopefully, this administration will learn the lessons of that, and referencing the people that have been suggested taking key positions in the foreign policy arena. Again, they have experience, they have background, they have knowledge, and an understanding of why it's important to put something hopefully in place more robust. And perhaps the relationship with Putin, which I think many Americans view as a negative, could be leveraged into some kind of positive position vis-a-vis the Iranians. Can't comment on the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. I'm just not smart enough and educated enough on that issue. And I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Jay. And Mara, before I turn it over to you, we'll do one more round of questions. I've got 4 in the queue. For our audience, please, if you have a question, now's the time. Type it in the Q&A, a box at the bottom of the screen. Mara, over to you.
Thanks. I'll just say on the Red Sea and Horn of Africa, I think we've really got to see who he names as his Secretary of Defense elect, because that's largely for the United States. A Defense Department military matter, and we have resource challenges. This goes to some of the points I made about Ukraine, about what we can do in other places, frankly, about if Israel continues at its current pace, what it needs from the United States, and the fact that our defense industrial base, writ large, needs to be improved in a variety of ways. But we are having trouble in producing the amount of equipment that we need to keep in stores for the United States. And the 155 is a particular example of that, and that Ukraine needs and that Israel needs. And we are largely with Brits, others, some in the region, defending international waterways right now in terms of the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. And so this again goes to the link between economic security and national security. And so there'll be people briefing President Trump on some of these interactions. The idea that you just cut a deal on Ukraine, and that ultimately that will give Russia a huge amount, including Russia's license to continue to do this in other places, and in ways that very directly endanger U.S. interests, and that may require U.S. boots on the ground. And so ending wars tomorrow, not clear what you're actually ending or not, and in which ways when you cut deals. And the same may apply in different ways. I share the view that Trump has certainly been public about the fact that he thinks the imagery that's coming out of Gaza and Lebanon is horrendous, and that Netanyahu, that goes to his advice to Netanyahu, you need to wrap this up quickly. But what that means, and again, how you wrap up without having a forward plan, is where the real question will come. And to me, this also goes to Nimrod's very good question about whether we'll see annexation or the kind of public claims for settlers and re-expansion. I actually view that that's less going to be, first, I don't think the United States is in the position, even though everyone always thinks we are, to say, you have a green light on this, you have a red light on that, and then the country we're saying it to just automatically acknowledges and acts in the way that we want. Whether it's Trump or Biden, that's not power the United States has. And though diplomacy is the art of letting others have it your way, it's an art and not a science, and not a black and white. To me, the biggest impediments to that kind of annexation happening are I don't know where Israel gets the resources to stay in Gaza, to reoccupy Gaza. There's all sorts of reasons that Prime Minister Sharon removed the military and moved settlers out of Gaza in 2005. And yes, and it was in combination with close relationships with the Bush administration and encouragement to execute on that plan. But it was also a resource issue for Israel and for its future. And if you already have reservists serving 3/4 of a year and away from, again, the economy and the Israeli economy showing the signs of it, what do you think is going to happen if you go forward with annexation and have to move settlers back in the case of Gaza, or reinforce the defense in both West Bank and Gaza? That may interact with whether there's a grand deal to be had with Iran. There's certainly press reporting on that today, that moderates supposedly within Iran are talking about, being able to get a deal with the Trump administration. I think Russia is key in this and watching. I took note of the fact that Ron Dermer went to Russia, supposedly for conversations about Lebanon. I would be shocked if those conversations were only about Lebanon. And so there may be, various people are looking again at how you move how different actors on the chessboard will move, and it's a three-dimensional game. So I think I'll be watching closely on how the Iran stuff plays out, and goes to how the relationship with Russia plays out as well.
Great, thank you. Terrific comments from the panel as always. Jay, I see your virtual hand is up. Did you want to intervene for a minute?
Well, just that if you can hear me all right, I think the communication's a little spotty on my end, but breaking news that the president-elect intends to nominate former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel.
Okay, so for the Israelis and
go.
others in the audience, that's a very, very important piece of news. Quite interesting, not what we were expecting. And perhaps that's consistent with what Mara was telling us before. Those who were out there trumpeting their chances maybe end up without a job at the end of the day.
I would just say that's also a huge bout of the evangelicals, and people should look at it that way. For those thinking that, in terms of whose interests are prevailing for Israel in the domestic United States, look at evangelicals and their vote.
Yeah, very, very, very good point. Excellent point. Okay, we have 4 remaining questions, which I will pose now to the panel, and then we'll take about 5 minutes or so from each of you, 6 minutes, and that will bring us near to the end when I'll have some closing comments. The first 2 of the 4 are from a single person, our very, very dear friend Dalia Schindlin from Israel. Her first question is, what is the likelihood, and you've addressed this a bit already, panel, but maybe you could go into a little bit more detail. What's the likelihood that David Friedman, former ambassador to Israel in the first Trump administration, a lawyer from New York City, bankruptcy lawyer from New York City, what's the likelihood that he will take a high-level position on the Middle East file, or even a broader foreign policy role in the new administration? And if so, could the administration conceivably follow his more recent plan for Israel, which essentially cancels out any sort of Palestinian self-determination and finalizes full Israeli annexation? You've addressed these issues, but perhaps you could make a fine point here about Dalia's first question. Dalia's second question is, what is the likelihood of a scenario in which the Trump administration gives Israel a quid pro quo, a free hand in Gaza, in return for constraints in the regional Iran situation to avoid an all-out regional war? So we'll let you do what you want in Gaza in exchange for you not, for example, attacking the Iranian nuclear installations and risking all-out regional war. Next question from Marion Klein in the United States. What is your take on Trump's promise to bring the hostages home? And I'm really glad that this issue was raised, given that we have Jay here with us. And then our last question, oh no, another one just came in, so second to last, from Yonis Anastasakis from Greece. Does the victory of the new president-elect put in danger the American checks and balances system? We could spend a year on that question. That's a really, really profound question. And then finally, from Chake Kuyumajian from the United States, forgive me if I mispronounced your name. Any hope that Trump's election will help in electing a Lebanese president, given that the office of the presidency of Lebanon has been vacant for the last 2 years? And if you could address how that plays in to the pressures from Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria, all acting on Lebanon. And then finally, last question, this one also just came in the last 30 seconds from Moha Enaji in Morocco. Will the new administration be able to stop the war in Palestine and Lebanon? And will the new Trump administration accept a two-state solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Let me thank our audience for your superb questions. We have 20 minutes left. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give about 4 minutes to each speaker. Not enough time to address all the questions, of course, in detail, but pick those that you want to focus on. 4 minutes per speaker, and then I'll wrap up at the end. And Zev, we'll go to you first.
I don't want to express any particular individual joining or not joining the administration. So as much as I respect Dalia, first of all, I don't know. And even if I did know, I wouldn't say whether or not an individual is going to join the administration. I would tend to think that when it comes to foreign policy, I think that the Secretary of State will have a lot to say. I don't think it is going to be a purely political decision. On the other hand, I think that the relationship that Netanyahu had and has with Biden is going to be a very different relationship that he will have and will have with President Trump. And I'm specifically focusing on the issue of he was much more flippant and much more willing to push back with Biden on whatever the issue may be. He will be much more careful in pushing back if he knows that this is what Trump wants and it's not just one of his designees or one of the people, Assistant Sec State, asking Israel to do A, B, or C. Trump will have the upper hand with the Prime Minister of Israel for the foreseeable future. And I think everything that we're saying we need to keep that in the back of our heads, because I really believe that. With regard to Israel attacking Iran, again, this goes back to the relationship, the bilateral relationship between not only Israel and the United States, but between the Prime Minister and the President. And I think that the United States will have much more leverage on what the Prime Minister of Israel wants to do than the current administration had and has for the next 2 months over Israel. And I frankly think that's a positive, because as Mara pointed out before, this president, no more wars. There were no wars when I was president 4 years ago. And therefore, I think he will, unless something egregious happens, he will be able to, I don't want to use the word tie Israel, but he will have tremendous influence, if not veto power, over what Israel may or may not want to do on Iran.
Okay, thank you, Zev. Jay?
So very, very quickly, one as it relates to a Lebanese president. Again, I think, first of all, you'll see, even in these final 2 months of the Biden administration, I think a serious effort to try and take advantage of the reshuffle, the degrading of Hezbollah and so forth, and a real effort to try and extend 1701 and to create opportunities for the Lebanese army to move south. Whether or not there's an ability to disarm the remaining armaments of Hezbollah remains to be seen, but I certainly think that a part of the priority for the current administration, and I expect for the Trump administration, will be to create some measure of stability, and part of that, of course, would be to fill the position of president, which has been unfilled for quite a while. The last thing is really regarding the hostages. In my view, it really comes down to two parties, Hamas and the Prime Minister of Israel. And so I think the Biden administration has pushed very, very hard on on parties. I won't say necessarily both parties. There's different leverage that they have with each, next to none with one, some with the other. I think there's been inconsistent pressure pushed. And I think the primary mediators, being Egypt and Qatar, can't want a deal more than the participants to this conflict themselves. So my guess is that they will still utilize the good offices of both the Egyptians and the Qataris to try and do all they can to bring both parties to the table. Obviously, we've heard that the Qataris have, I'd say, rethought the utility of having the political leadership of Hamas remain in Qatar, and have questioned whether or not they will continue in a mediation role that they've been playing. From the perspective that I've been able to take part in over the last year, I think their role is critical. And they're trusted by the Israelis. Never mind the political chatter that you hear from certain offices. There's a long-standing relationship there between the Israeli intelligence community and the Qataris, and more than that, they've delivered. 109 individuals are back home because of primarily Qatar mediation. Now, they can't flip a switch. Back to Mara's description, the United States can't say to a country, do this, greenlight this, and I get all the time, why don't the Qataris tell Hamas to do X, Y, and Z? It's not that simple. They don't give orders, and those orders are they don't even have direct communication with those on the ground in Gaza. It's much more complex than that. But I have every reason to believe that the Trump administration will rely upon the same countries to help with this mediation, and we hope that they're brought home without another day wasted.
And Jay, before I go to Mara, can you share with us, this is public and we're being recorded, so understand if you can't, but any sense of how many of the hostages are still alive?
No, I think I'm not privy to that kind of information. I'm not sure if anyone truthfully is, but each day that passes obviously involves more risk.
Thank you so much, Jay. Mara, we'll come to you as our final wrap-up speaker, and then I will take a couple of minutes at the end. Go ahead, Mara.
Thanks, Steve. I just want to pick up on one point that Jay made about the import of the role of the Qataris, and I bring that up. They obviously made an announcement over the last couple of days that they were stepping back. Frankly, because neither of the parties who are decision makers were interested at this point ready to make a deal. But I think someone earlier in this conversation suggested somehow the Saudis would step into the Qataris role. I think that's not an accurate view to me of how the Saudis would use their leverage. If they're smart and they want a way going forward, it will be to find ways to ideally shift the incentives of the two entities, the decision makers, but with Qatar continuing in that role. I mean, even more than Egypt, they really have developed a deep expertise in how to get this stuff done, and not just with these parties, but with respect to hostages in a lot of places. So I would say that on Iran and Iran's nuclear capability, I just want to do a little bit of it. And on the assumption, Zev, I did not say that Donald Trump would not have wars in his administration. I understand that he has said that publicly, but I think it goes to a misperception about what is in the control of the president of the United States and what is not. And what you get tested on is how you react, not necessarily what your campaign promise has been. And so the ability to stop conflicts throughout the world versus whether you're putting U.S. military in the midst of it, or whether you're continuing to defend the waterways, the international shipping lanes, or you're going to retract from that role. There's a number of hard decisions that come into play when you're actually in office. And so, but just as one example, during the campaign period, President Trump on the record told Israel they should go after Iran's nuclear capabilities. He may now think it's better to have a deal. He said that publicly. The other thing folks should keep in mind is that Israel can't actually act in that way without specific support from the United States, specific military support. And so whoever's in the administration needs to be on board in one way or another with executing a plan like that. When he wasn't in charge of making those decisions, President Trump, he certainly encouraged Israel to take that kind of action. When he has to live with the consequences of it, it'll be interesting to see, but I would guess there are voices among his team that argue both sides of that quite strongly. And it also goes to, I guess what I want to address most though is Dahlia's question, not on personnel, but on, there's not a deal. I don't know what Dahlia's imagining. The idea that first of all, that the United States could say to Israel, do whatever you want in Gaza and Hamas, just stay out of a regional war, goes to the points Jay made. It's not how the United States role works. But beyond that, there is not I think the calibration that Israel doing whatever it wants, freehand in Gaza and in Lebanon means that you can deal with Iran however you like, ignores where the real life interactions are between Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. That's not going to go away. And so, I don't think that a future Trump administration is likely to agree, however, conceptually with that kind of quid pro quo for a variety of reasons that we've talked about. And B, I don't think it's possible. Anyway, even if they were interested, that's not how the facts on the ground would tend to play out. The one other point, I don't know if it was in a direct question or if I just saw it in the lineup. There was somebody who asked about, basically, wouldn't President Trump now be more sensitive to Arab American voices? Maybe that's implied by the fact that Tiffany Trump, one of his daughters, is married to somebody who's Lebanese American, or the meetings he had during the campaign with some leaders in Michigan. I think anyone who believes that should go and buy a bridge in Brooklyn at whatever price is given them. Look at how the guy operates, look at what he says and what he does. And I think there are going to be a lot of people who look at their votes in November and have significant buyer's remorse. And what we're going to have to do, this goes back to my point at the beginning, is hold him accountable for the things he breaks that can be fixed in various ways, and do everything possible. And this goes to the question about checks and balances in the US system. Do everything possible. And we still have a lot of opportunity to litigate, and we're good litigators in this country and courts throughout the country. There are various ways in terms of checks and balances, and also in the Senate, if Senate Majority Leader gets elected, who is an institutionalist, again, there's still checks and balances in the system, even when one party controls all three houses. And there are a lot of people laser focused on how you keep things from being broken that are not fixable.
Yes, let me thank you, Mara. And I was just going to add there that as an example of what you're talking about, we had a Republican senator from Alabama in a Democratic-controlled Senate holding up more than 100 of President Biden's appointments to the Pentagon. Those practiced in the parliamentary intricacies of the Senate can be quite good, even when they're in the minority, at obfuscating, delaying, obstructing, and we may see more of that even as early as February, late January, February, March of next year. We have to keep our eye on that, of course. All right, well, we're at the end. Let me express on behalf of UCLA CMED my sincere gratitude to our three terrific, wonderful panelists. This was a great discussion. Really appreciate your time and your commentary. Also, my sincere appreciation to our audience for your superb questions, as always. I want to thank again our co-sponsors here at UCLA, the Burkle Center, the Nazarian Center, and the Department of Public Policy. And I want to thank our wonderful staff, Salome Mohajer, Emily Pistol, and Laura Lee, who worked very, very hard behind the scenes. I think we've had 4 webinars or 5 webinars this academic quarter. Not a complaint from any of our staff. They've done superb work. Luckily for them, this is the last planned webinar for the current academic quarter. We'll be back after the first of the year with more. I just want to express my gratitude to them for their really, really terrific work. If you have not already joined our mailing list, please send us a message Our email address is there at the bottom of the screen that you see before you, cmed@international.ucla.edu. I'll bring this session to a close with my best wishes to all of you for the upcoming holiday season, for the turn of the year 2024 to 2025. We'll be back next year with more webinars, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all very, very much, and bye-bye.